Orpheus and Eurydice. When they told him Eurydice is dead, their words fell to the bottom of his heart. It wasn't that he refused to understand them. It was that her name combined with the idea of death was incomprehensible. The 6 syllables, Eurydice is dead, echoed in a place inside his mind that he had never before inhabited, a place buried so far beneath the diverse selves of his poetic nature that he was lost. Again they told him, Eurydice is dead. Still he refused to acknowledge them. His eyes glared at them, astonished, as if their message were impossible, as if the death of a woman, a mortal, violated the laws of his universe. He stood transfixed, severed from himself, as if his grief had disengaged his sense, as if he feared that habits as familiar as motion and speech might become acceptance, as if his world fastened to Eurydice had been ripped out in empathy at the thought of her passing into the realm of the dead. And when they that had told him finally left, he did not know that they had gone away. All outward sense had gone from him. His mind rejected 10,000 futures of a life without her soul at its center, until all his wild, hopeful thoughts dissolved into a silent, uncompromising present, until his mind in violent overturning exhausted itself and became quiet. At first he didn't recognize sight without thought. He had never measured before how much words, as illuminating as his language was, overshadowed his fine perceptiveness. His eyes, unaccustomed to being eclipsed by the receptive body of his soul, took in everything without closeness, diffused, as if he could be everywhere at once. Animals approached his open gaze and stared into it, as if it were a wide landscape, and the trees near him that had once bowed down to his impossible charm now seemed to retreat further into the dark mist of the forest, and the wind that had once before his voice stopped now blew through him, unraveling the seams that held his spirit inside his body. Finally he was pulled to the earth and slept. He slept, or part of him slept. A second part was awakened by a shimmering light, a light of powerful present substance, a light that should have been recognizable, except that he, unacquainted with gods, saw instead his own fear and confusion. He did not know that this was the messenger, the one he had summoned with his desire, the one that would take him to Eurydice. For Orpheus, this new world without sense, without a preference for past or future, without the height and depth of physicality, confused him because it lacked the signposts of a single encompassing perspective. Objects were there without reaching or grasping or any possibility of holding. All around him they rose up and fell away, made up as they were, not of the elements, but of the shifting sands of light and spirit. Somehow he uttered, "Who?" without a mouth. Without lips or a tongue, it was hurled up out of some secret depths of questioning. Again he uttered, "Whoo!" and watched how his voice expanded and filled the surrounding space before it fell away. This he could be. This was an identity he understood. Voice. Pure, uninhibited, resonant voice. What could have been better for a poet? He was amazed, but was still more amazed when that unknown present light engulfed him and from within him answered, "Hermes." That communication could be intimate and without boundary or symbol pleased him. That he could enter the other without an angular outside positioning astounded his sympathetic nature. What could have been better for a lover? And there was more amazement to come, for his gaze was by the god directed downward and fell on what he had abandoned. It lay unoccupied, without dimension, like a crumpled wrapper that had been cast off, like a heap of clothes that, without a body, had collapsed into its own uselessness. He now realized that he was among the dead. His fear opened before him as an abyss. It consumed him in a feeling of falling, terrified him with long whirlpool sinking. Without the perspective of a body standing firmly on a planet, he slipped from creation's grasp into the void that emerged trailing behind the engulfing futility of his apprehension. The messenger god could not touch him, for he had fallen beneath the deepest floor the god's more permanent tenancy could reach. Hermes waited until Orpheus completed the orbit of his indulgence, and when Orpheus returned out of himself, the god delivered his commissioned trust. "I am to take you to Eurydice," not without some joy and expectation, yet more wary of the shifting foundations of his spirit. Orpheus followed the god. That such a passage could be simply wishing that Orpheus, passing by 10,000 memories of Eurydice, could, startled and unprepared, find himself at the far end of his crossing with her. This amazed him. This, he thought, was invocation. This was a conjuring trick that surpassed the wildest reaches of his inspiration. He was again with her, had again attained her. Yet even that first joy was absorbed into a distance that was her, but not her. The Eurydice he now encountered had grown in consciousness, but not in focus. Death had taken Eurydice alone, and she, unaccustomed to love without him, had been unable to maintain her devotion. Her desire had simply been washed away like an unanchored boat, and now she drifted among the dead, untethered to her life's purpose, which had been the cultivation of his love. Her love had been given, yet not possessed. It had never been completely lodged in the foundations of her better self. She had always wrapped her existence around the will of his greater magnetism, and now hoped through him to regain her force. She engulfed his impassioned resolution inside her deep, diffused receiving as if it were a coin, swallowed by a dark pocket. She, like a black wind turned inside out, tried to pull his existence into her dark night. But Orpheus resisted her. He retreated and withstood their imminent enfolding. They were not alone. Something immense had stretched the void of existing around them. It was as if from behind them another sky had poured itself out from the recesses of a consciousness and crouched, waiting in the pit and hollow of eternity. It was the goddess of the dead, Persephone. Orpheus had entered death, circumventing death. Drawn away from the joys of living on the extremity of his grief, he had passed into death without dying, so that his arrival in that dark realm had echoed like a song resounding in a great underground cave shrouded in centuries of silent, solemn mourning. He erupted on the world of the dead as the sun bursts forth on the frigidity of a December landscape at dawn, and his presence trailed such a disturbance that Persephone herself had recoiled in the wake of its palpitation. She emerged with tense instinctive expectation surrounding his intrusion that had invaded the space that was her own flesh wounded. What else could Orpheus have done? He charmed her. He gathered together all his exuberance and flooded the walls of Hades with music. He sang of the gods praising their endurance. He sang of the joys of the living, of the green planet's unfathomed beauty. He sang of the greatness of existing and of the lament of great loneliness. He sang of the one he loved, of his grief, and of his journey into death to regain her. He sang, and the whole soul-inhabited landscape of Hades contracted to be nearer the light of his fine, precise invoking, to be nearer music that in its vibration could for a time relieve the torments of the damned. He sang, and the goddess, she was enchanted. She took pity on the separated lovers and allowed them a present with no turning back. She allowed Orpheus to remain with Eurydice in Hades until a time when he would long to be remade in flesh, until he would again desire mortality. Allowing this and then trailing a whole inhabited domain of souls behind her magnetic attractiveness, she receded. No turning back. Orpheus did not consider the condition the goddess had imposed. His joy overflowed in his victory, his conquered wooing, his good luck, his success. He had before so often assembled himself around Eurydice that he now flung himself toward her, expecting foundation. While she had lived, their love had embodied the very nature and fashion of intimacy. They had defined unbounded devotion, and now once more he took her without withholding, falling uncollected among the dark folds of her freshly cut disengagement. He entered her again and again, yet could not embed his existence in her boundlessness. She was fading. In her too open absorption, she tried to consume him, hoping to contain him. She received him as the night receives the dusk, diffusing his essence along the open-ended channels of her vapor-like feeling. He sought desperately to rebuild her from the shifting sands of her unfolding death, But it was too late. She was already expanded out beyond the boundaries of his gathering. She was already clouds blown by the wind. She had lost the edge of her being and now mingled unfocused in the landscape. And Orpheus, forgetting the partition the goddess had set around them, recoiled. He longed to see her closed in the flesh that had caged her lost mortality. He longed to turn back. He awoke as into a dream of sleeping, lying under the tree where he had fallen. He looked out and saw his lyre in the grass. He heard a stream, heard water splashing over rocks. He even felt cold when a wind rose up and blew dry leaves, turning over his arms and chest. His spirit radiated out from his body as if his heart were a blinding sun locked in the human cage that was his chest. But when the evening came, without thinking, he lifted his hands up and rubbed his eyes, and so startled himself that he leapt up, screaming. Then both days and nights he wandered wildly, inconsolable and without belief in the final reality of the living. He sang and chanted strange, esoteric songs of visions and futures, so disconnected, so inconceivable and removed from sense that all who heard him believed that his grief had led him down the path of madness. Finally, the nymphs, unable to sleep because of his haunting, disturbing voice, ripped his flesh apart and scattered it back to the earth where once again it might rest. But the head, defying death, went on singing. Now he was not the poet. He was all poets. And what he had become ascended to the constellation that, formed from his lyre, provided orbit and habitation for a larger broadcasting, a more star-like, uninhibited, lyrical singing.